Imagine walking into a bank with pride and purpose, only to be judged, questioned, and humiliated, all because of who you are. Your skin color. What would you do? Today was supposed to be a special day for Jonah Evans, a day that marked the result of years of sweat, grit, and endless determination. Jonah was a self-made millionaire, a man who had achieved what most only dream of. Growing up with very little, he had worked tirelessly to build his business from the ground up, overcoming every obstacle life threw his way. Now he was here, standing tall, feeling proud of everything he'd accomplished. Today, he wasn't just at the bank for a routine errand. He was here with a purpose. He was finalizing the purchase of a big, beautiful house, a place to call home and share with his family. The moment he walked through those doors, he felt eyes on him. Subtle at first, but then unmistakable. A few people turned to glance his way, their gazes lingering just a little too long before darting away. It was almost easy to miss, but Jonah felt it. A small shift in the air, like the faint flicker of shadows across a sunlit room. At first, he brushed it off. He was focused on the task at hand, feeling good about what he was here to do. With purpose in his stride, he made his way across the lobby, his polished shoes tapping against the marble floor. But as he walked further, the weight of those stairs grew heavier, more pronounced. A knot of tension began forming in his chest. He noticed a woman standing in line to his left, her gaze flickering up at him. Eyes widening just a bit, her hand moved almost instinctively, clutching her purse closer to her body, her posture shifting away from him. Jonah couldn't hear her thoughts, but her actions spoke louder than words. As he continued toward the teller, he caught the eye of a security guard standing by the door. The guard, who had seemed relaxed moments before, stiffened, his watchful gaze narrowing just slightly. It was as if an invisible signal had passed through the room, connecting every glance, whisper, and uneasy movement. Each step forward felt heavier, each glance sharper, as though he was walking into a place where he didn't quite belong. Jonah approached the counter, hoping that a friendly greeting from the teller might wash away this strange tension. But as he reached the front, he was met with a look that was anything but welcoming. The teller, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a tight-lipped expression, looked him up and down, her gaze traveling from his polished shoes to the designer watch on his wrist, lingering just a bit too long on each item. Her expression shifted subtly from polite curiosity to something colder, her lips pressing into a thin, disapproving line. He greeted her with a warm smile, trying to keep things light, but her response was curt, clipped, as though there was a barrier between them that she had no intention of lowering. He presented his ID and explained why he was there, feeling that same swell of pride as he spoke about his plans. But as he handed over his identification, he noticed the way her eyes narrowed, suspicion flashing across her face. She looked at his ID, then back at him, and the silence stretched just a little too long. It was a look Jonah knew well, a look that told him she saw not a successful businessman but someone who didn't fit her image of belonging. Around him, the murmurs grew louder. He could hear fragments of whispers, snippets of conversations he couldn't fully make out. A group of people seated nearby exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes darting toward him and then quickly away, as if they'd been caught looking. He could feel the weight of those whispers settling on his shoulders, and the knot in his chest tightened. A feeling of helplessness started to creep in, one he hadn't felt in years. Here he was, a man who had overcome everything life threw at him. Yet in this moment, he felt reduced to a set of assumptions and biases. He wanted to say something, to break the silence, but his words caught in his throat. Every gaze, every murmur, every subtle shift in posture around him was like a reminder that no matter how much he'd accomplish, there would always be those who saw him differently. The teller's fingers drummed on the edge of the counter as she finally, reluctantly, glanced down at the ID. She stared at it for a long moment, her face expressionless. Then, in a voice that carried an edge of disbelief, she said, "This is yours." The question hung in the air, each word landing like a punch. Jonah felt a rush of anger, but he held it back, his jaw tightening. He nodded, forcing himself to stay calm. "Yes, it is," he replied evenly, hoping his tone would remind her of the respect he deserved, the respect he had earned. The teller raised an eyebrow, still unconvinced. She looked back down at the ID, then back up at Jonah, as if the man standing in front of her was somehow different from the one in the picture. "This is a lot of money you're dealing with," she said, her voice low but cold, the implication hanging heavily between them. "Are you sure everything here is in order?" It was more than a question. It was an accusation, thinly veiled and dripping with judgment. Jonah felt his face flush with frustration and embarrassment as he realized that the teller wasn't just being thorough. She was questioning his legitimacy, his right to be here, his right to conduct business in the same way any other client would. He glanced around, hoping that perhaps someone else might intervene, but the other tellers and staff members kept their distance, glancing his way with expressions that ranged from curious to wary. The teller's voice grew louder as she looked around, her eyes catching the attention of a nearby manager. She raised the ID, waving it slightly as she called over to him. "Could you come take a look at this?" she said, her tone sharp and commanding. It was as if she were signaling an alarm, alerting everyone around them that something was wrong, that Jonah was a threat. The manager approached, and the teller handed him the ID, explaining in a hushed voice that was just loud enough for Jonah to overhear. "It just doesn't seem right," she murmured, her eyes darting toward Jonah, as if she expected him to do something, to reveal himself as the fraud she seemed so convinced he was. The manager took the ID, examining it with a frown, his gaze flickering briefly to Jonah before returning to the card in his hand. Jonah stood there, his heart pounding, feeling like he was on trial for a crime he hadn't committed. He wanted to speak up, to demand an explanation for this treatment, but the words caught in his throat. Around him, the whispers grew louder, a low hum of voices filled with curiosity, suspicion, and judgment. He could feel the eyes of the other customers, the way they leaned in, craning their necks to get a better look at him, to watch this unfolding drama as if it were a show put on just for their entertainment. The teller's tone shifted again, even louder, as she continued her inquisition. "This is an unusual amount for an account like yours," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet space of the bank. She didn't bother to hide her skepticism, her disbelief that someone like Jonah could be handling this level of business. Her voice grew louder with each sentence, each word carrying an accusation that seemed to grow heavier with every second. Jonah felt his stomach tighten as he looked around, hoping, almost desperately, that someone, anyone, might step in, that someone might recognize the unfairness of this treatment. But all he saw were strangers, their faces filled with curiosity, watching him with expressions that mirrored the teller's suspicion. No one spoke up. No one challenged her. He was alone, standing in the middle of the bank, feeling the weight of every judgmental glance, every hushed whisper. As the manager handed back his ID with a wary expression, Jonah felt the heat of humiliation rise to his face. The teller's eyes were still fixed on him, a look of cold satisfaction in her gaze, as if she had proven some unspoken point. She leaned back, crossing her arms with a look that seemed to say, "Now, are you ready to admit who you really are?" But Jonah held his ground. Despite the tension, despite the anger simmering just beneath the surface, he stood tall. He wasn't going to let her rob him of his dignity. He was here to conduct his business, just like anyone else, and he wasn't about to let anyone question his right to do so. Jonah Evans had never felt so exposed, so surrounded, and yet so utterly alone. As he stood by the teller's counter, he watched the manager scrutinize his ID, turning it over and over as if he expected something incriminating to leap off the plastic. The teller stood next to him, her arms crossed tightly, a look of grim satisfaction on her face, as though she'd uncovered some great deception. One by one, more bank employees started to gather, their expressions unreadable, but their body language was unmistakable, postures tense, eyes narrowed, and arms crossed protectively. They weren't here to help. They were here to watch, to bear silent witness to whatever it was they suspected Jonah of doing. Jonah glanced around, feeling the walls closing in, his heartbeat pulsing in his ears. Every breath he took felt shallower than the last as the weight of their judgment pressed down on him. This wasn't just suspicion. This was condemnation. As he tried to keep his composure, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. Several customers had started gathering nearby, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding scene. He heard the low hum of murmurs, snippets of conversations that made his stomach twist. "Who does he think he is?" a voice whispered. "What's he even doing here?" another added, the words tinged with suspicion. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of judgment that echoed in his mind. He could feel their eyes on him, dissecting him, labeling him, reducing him to their own assumptions. And then, to his horror, he saw a few of them raise their phones, cameras pointed in his direction. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about suspicion anymore. It was about spectacle. They were capturing his humiliation, reducing his identity, his accomplishments, his entire life to a few seconds of footage. Jonah felt his face flush with shame, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He could feel the heat rising to his cheeks, a burning embarrassment that threatened to consume him. Part of him wanted to turn, to walk away from the counter, to escape the prying eyes and the whispered accusations. But a stronger part of him, the part that had fought for every inch of success, that had defied every expectation and broken through every barrier, refused to back down. As he held his ground, the manager's questioning took on a sharper, more invasive tone. "Mr. Evans," he said, his voice cold and clinical, "this is quite an unusual transaction. We need to ensure that everything is above board." The words dripped with insinuation, and Jonah could feel the implication hanging heavy in the air. They didn't see a successful businessman. They saw someone trying to cheat the system, someone who didn't belong. "Do you have any other identification?" The manager pressed, his gaze never wavering, his expression unrelenting. "Something to prove that you are, indeed, who you say you are." The question was a slap in the face, each word more cutting than the last. Jonah's stomach twisted with anger and frustration, the humiliation pressing down on him like a physical weight. He had already provided his ID, already answered their questions, and yet, here they were, demanding more proof, more explanations, as though his very presence in this bank was an affront. "I've given you everything you need," Jonah replied, his voice steady but tinged with anger. "This is my account. I have every right to be here." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The manager only looked at him with a cool, indifferent expression, as though Jonah's insistence was nothing more than an inconvenience. He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms, his posture a silent signal of defiance. Around them, the crowd of onlookers grew, their whispers a steady hum that filled the air, each word slicing through Jonah's composure like a blade. "Can you believe he's still here?" someone murmured. "Why doesn't he just leave?" Another voice added, the question laced with disdain. Just as the humiliation reached its peak, the manager spoke again, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. "We'll need to verify this transaction with upper management," he said, each word laced with suspicion. He turned, gesturing to one of the other employees to call someone from the back office. It was clear that they were making an example out of him, that they were determined to drag out this ordeal as long as possible. Jonah's mind raced. Should he speak up, demand the respect he deserved, or should he turn and walk away, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing his pain? But before he could decide, he heard a voice. A soft, quiet voice that cut through the noise, a voice that made him pause. A young woman standing nearby, her eyes filled with compassion and understanding, stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but I think he deserves to be treated with respect. He's done nothing wrong." But the manager's expression remained cold, unyielding. He glanced at the young woman, dismissing her with a look of irritation before turning back to Jonah. "Sir," he said, his voice edged with impatience, "I need you to wait here while we verify your identity." The humiliation lingered, the weight of the crowd's judgment pressing down on him. But Jonah met the manager's gaze, a spark of defiance in his eyes. He wasn't going to let them strip him of his dignity. Not today. And as he stood there, facing the silent stares and whispered accusations, he knew that he wouldn't back down, that he wouldn't let their prejudice define him. He was Jonah Evans, a man who had defied expectations, who had risen above every obstacle, and no amount of judgment or suspicion would take that away from him. Just as Jonah Evans thought he'd reached the end of his patience, something unexpected happened. From across the lobby, a tall man in a suit was striding toward the counter, his expression changing the moment he saw Jonah. It was Thomas Reynolds, a senior bank executive known for his high-profile role in managing elite clients. Jonah had met Thomas years ago, back when his business was just getting off the ground. They'd shared conversations over coffee, and Thomas knew exactly who Jonah was, not just as a client, but as a respected figure in the business world. Thomas's face lit up with recognition, and without hesitation, he crossed the floor and approached the cluster of staff hovering around Jonah. As he reached the counter, his brows furrowed, his gaze shifting between the teller, the manager, and the confused onlookers. Clearing his throat, he broke the tense silence. "Jonah, I didn't expect to see you today." Thomas greeted him warmly, extending a hand. "Is everything all right here?" The room seemed to freeze. Every staff member, every customer, every whisper fell silent as people processed the scene before them. The teller's smug expression slipped, her face draining of color as she glanced nervously at Thomas, then back at Jonah. The manager, who moments before had been grilling Jonah with doubt and condescension, now looked utterly stunned, his mouth slightly open, his previous authority deflating before everyone's eyes. Jonah shook Thomas's hand, feeling a rush of relief and vindication all at once. Thomas turned to the teller and the manager, his usually composed face now showing hints of frustration. "Is there a reason why one of our most respected clients is being treated this way?" His tone was sharp, leaving no room for excuses. The teller stammered, looking down at her hands as she fumbled for an explanation. We were just making sure everything was in order, sir," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Her previous confidence was gone, replaced by a look of shock and embarrassment that was almost painful to watch. "Making sure everything was in order," Thomas repeated, his tone incredulous. He looked back at Jonah, a mixture of sympathy and disbelief in his eyes. Turning to the crowd of bank employees who had gathered, he raised his voice. "Do any of you realize who this man is? Jonah Evans didn't just walk in off the street. He's a leader in our community, a successful entrepreneur who has invested more in this city than most of us combined." His words hung in the air, each sentence a direct rebuke to the staff who had treated Jonah like an outsider. The teller's face was a picture of stunned disbelief, her mouth slightly open as her eyes flickered between Thomas and Jonah. The manager, looking visibly uncomfortable, stepped back, his arms folding tightly across his chest, as if trying to shield himself from the weight of Thomas's words. Jonah could see the realization dawning in their eyes, the slow, humiliating understanding of the mistake they'd made. Thomas turned back to Jonah, offering an apology on behalf of the bank. "I'm sorry for the treatment you received here today, Jonah. This is not how we handle our clients, and I'll make sure that this matter is addressed." For a moment, Jonah felt a swell of relief, a sense that the humiliation he'd experienced was finally being recognized. But as he looked around the room, at the faces of the staff, the customers who'd been watching and whispering, something shifted within him. He realized he had a choice. He could walk away, accept Thomas's apology, and leave quietly, or he could take this moment to address the deeper issue, the unspoken prejudice that had filled the room from the moment he'd walked in. He took a deep breath, letting the silence of the room settle over him. And then he began to speak, his voice calm but resolute. "I appreciate your apology, Thomas," Jonah said, looking around at the faces that were now riveted to him. "But what happened here today is bigger than a simple misunderstanding. It's a reminder that no matter how successful you become, no matter how hard you work, there are people who will see you and make judgments based solely on appearances." He looked directly at the teller, whose face flushed with shame, her eyes darting to the floor. "When I walked into this bank, I was treated like an intruder, like someone who didn't belong. My integrity was questioned, my motives were doubted, and I was made to feel like I was somehow less than everyone else in this room." His words were measured, each one landing with a quiet power that echoed through the bank. "This isn't just about me," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "This is about every person who's ever been judged, every person who's ever been made to feel small because of someone else's assumptions, and it needs to change." There was a stillness in the room, a weight in the air that seemed to press down on everyone present. Jonah could see the impact of his words, the quiet shift in the faces around him as people absorbed the gravity of what he was saying. For some, there was a look of discomfort, a realization of their own silent complicity in the events that had unfolded. For others, there was a flicker of empathy, an understanding that reached beyond the moment, a recognition of the deeper message Jonah was conveying. Thomas cleared his throat, nodding in agreement. "You're absolutely right, Jonah. And I assure you, this incident will not be taken lightly. Changes need to be made, and they will be." Jonah gave a small nod of appreciation. He had said his piece, had taken a painful experience, and turned it into something powerful, something that would linger in the minds of everyone in that bank long after he left. As he turned to go, he cast one last look at the crowd, the silent witnesses who had watched the entire scene unfold. Without another word, he walked through the lobby, his steps measured and dignified. No one moved, no one spoke. They simply watched him go, the weight of his words hanging in the air like an unbreakable thread, a reminder of the strength it took to stand tall in the face of prejudice. As Jonah walked out of the bank, he felt a sense of closure, a deep, resonant feeling that he had turned a moment of humiliation into one of strength, a chance to speak truth into a space that needed it. And he knew that his words, his actions, would leave an imprint not only on those who had judged him, but on everyone who had witnessed it. A call for respect, dignity, and above all, the courage to see beyond the surface. If this story moved you and made you think, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge assumptions and inspire change. Join us on this journey. Your support helps us bring these important messages to more people.